When most people sit down to tell the story of the United States, they almost instinctively reach for the volume knob and just, crank it all the way up. They talk about the loud stuff. You know what I mean? The Revolutionary Wars, the huge economic crashes, the fierce shouting match election cycles. It's always fireworks.
It's a blockbuster movie version of history.
Yeah.
Lots of special effects, not a lot of quiet dialogue.
That is a perfect way to put it. But here's the question I want to throw at you to start our deep dive today.
Yeah.
What if we just stripped all of that away?
Okay.
If you mute the noise of the headlines and the history books, is there something else humming underneath? Is there an underlying, an operating system or a specific spirit that actually drives the nation?
That's a fascinating question because we so often confuse the events of history with the character of the nation. We look at what happened, not why it happened or who made it happen.
Right.
And today, we're looking at a really compelling piece of analysis that tries to identify that quieter, deeper layer.
We are digging into an article published by the Hale Institute, that's the Human and AI Learning Institute, and it's titled The Spirit and Civic Identity of the United States. Now, I know. Civic identity sounds a little bit like a high school homework assignment you procrastinated on.
It does sound a bit dry on the surface, I'll give you that.
But once you actually crack this thing open, the mission is pretty specific, and honestly, it's kind of gripping. We want to move beyond the dates and battles and look at what the source calls these civic habits.
And cultural impulses.
Yeah, exactly. This is really a conversation about soft power, the internal wiring that, defines American identity.
And what stands out immediately in this reading is that this isn't framed as some dusty history lesson.
Wow.
It's framed as an investigation into a living legacy. The argument here is that there are these specific behavioral traits, almost like personality quirks of the country, that connect the founding ideals from, the 1700s directly to the United States' role in the modern global city.
And I have to say, some of these habits are actually pretty unusual when you compare them to the rest of the world. I think we take them for granted if we live here, but when you zoom out, you realize, oh, that's actually a distinct flavor.
It is.
So let's unpack this. The source starts right at the foundation, the bedrock.
Liberty. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, okay, we know this, freedom and justice for all, the source adds a really crucial layer of nuance here.
Okay.
The United States was founded on that radical idea that human beings have inherent rights, and the government's job is just to protect them. That's the headline. But the source argues the founders understood there was a catch.
I feel like there's always a catch when you're trying to build a new form of government from scratch.
The catch is that a republic can't survive on laws alone. You can write the best constitution in the world, ink it on the finest parchment, but it's just paper if the people don't have a specific type of character.
Right.
The source calls this the double awareness.
Okay. This was the first moment in the reading where I had to just pause and really think. Because usually when we talk about freedom, we talk about what we're allowed to do. But this double awareness thing seems to be about what we should do.
That's the distinction.
Yeah.
Exactly. The source breaks it down into inward awareness and outward awareness.
Let's look at inward awareness first. When I read inward, I immediately thought of, meditation or wellness apps. But I don't think the founding fathers were talking about mindfulness breathing, were they?
Not quite, no.
Yeah.
In this context, inward awareness is more about self-knowledge, moral clarity, and personal responsibility. Think of it as the internal governor.
Okay.
It's the ability of a citizen to govern their own impulses so that they don't require a tyrant to govern them from the outside.
Okay, I want to push back on that a little bit, just to play devil's advocate. Why does the system rely on my internal character? Can't I just follow the written laws, pay my taxes, stay in my lane, and call it a day? Why do I need moral clarity to keep the republic running?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The argument the source makes, and this tracks with political philosophers like Madison or Adams, is that laws have loopholes. Laws are reactive.
Right.
If you don't have that internal governor, you will constantly push the boundaries of the law for your own gain. And if everyone does that, society collapses into chaos, and then people start demanding a strong man to restore order.
So if you can't control yourself, eventually someone else is going to have to control you.
Precisely. That's the inward piece. But then you have the outward awareness.
Which is understanding society and recognizing that we're all interdependent and, caring for others.
And the argument the source makes is that a healthy republic relies entirely on the tension between these two. If you have only inward focus, you become selfish and isolated. If you have only outward focus, you might lose your sense of individual agency and just become a cog in the machine.
So the takeaway here is that freedom isn't just a slogan you put on a bumper sticker. It's a lived practice. It's this constant juggling act between I'm responsible for myself and I'm part of a community.
And that bridge right there between the individual and the community, that leads us directly to the second pillar the source identifies, the spirit of help.
This is where it gets really interesting to me, because this is one of those things that seems so normal until you actually look at the data.
Right.
The source points out that social scientists consistently find that Americans volunteer and donate at rates that are just. They're unmatched by most other nations. It's described as a cultural constant. But again, I have to ask, why? Is it something in the water?
It's something in the history. I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the environment where this culture was formed.
Yeah.
The source points specifically to the frontier.
Ah, the frontier. Okay, this makes sense. I was thinking about this while reading. It's like, before 911 existed, your insurance policy was just being nice to Bob next door.
That's a funny way to put it, but it's pretty accurate. For a long time in American history, there was no government agency coming to save you if your crop failed or your house burned down.
Right.
Survival depended on mutual aid.
Yeah.
If you didn't help your neighbor raise his barn, you might be the one left freezing when your roof collapsed next winter.
So it wasn't just altruism. It was like practical. It was survival.
It was a survival strategy that hardened into a cultural reflex.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the frontier. The source really emphasizes immigrant community networks as a huge driver here.
Right, because when new groups arrived, whether it was the Irish, the Italians, or later Asian or Latino communities, they often couldn't rely on the mainstream banks or institutions.
They were often shut out of those institutions completely, so they had to build their own safety nets from scratch. Benevolent societies, community chests, informal lending circles. That just reinforces this deep-seated idea that we take care of each other because nobody else will.
So you have this grassroots, neighbor-to-neighbor spirit of help. But then the source shifts gears and talks about how this scaled up. It went from I'll help you fix your fence to what they call the spirit of generosity on a national level.
And this is the transition from individual action to institutional habit. We see the rise of these benevolent societies in the 18th and 19th centuries, which eventually evolved into the massive philanthropic foundations we see today. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Gates.
Right.
The source notes that in the U.S., giving isn't seen as some exceptional behavior. It's largely expected.
And this didn't stop at the border either. The source lists some massive international examples. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, responses to tsunamis and famines.
The Marshall Plan is probably the most potent example here. After World War II, the U.S. poured billions into rebuilding Europe. But we're not just talking about rebuilding allies. They poured money into rebuilding Germany and Italy, their former enemies.
That is the part that always blows my mind. Usually in history, the victor takes the spoils, they loot the factories, they don't pay to upgrade them.
It was a historically rare move, a very rare move.
But wait, I have to pause here. I can hear the cynics listening, and honestly, the cynic in my own head saying, come on, the United States didn't just do that out of the kindness of its heart. We were trying to stop the spread of communism, right? It was a chess move.
You are absolutely right to point that out, and the source doesn't shy away from it at all. It explicitly notes that these actions were not always pure or free of strategic interest.
Okay.
The Marshall Plan was absolutely about securing a capitalist bulwark against the Soviet Union.
So it was self-interest disguised as charity?
Well, the source argues it was both. And this is a key nuance. Just because there was strategy involved, it doesn't mean the generosity wasn't real or widely felt by the people receiving the flour and the steel.
Right.
Two things can be true at once. It can be a smart strategic play, and it can be a genuinely generous act.
It's that intersection of doing well and doing good. Okay, so we've got liberty, we've got help, we've got generosity. But then the source describes a shift. Starting in the early 20th century, that spirit of help evolves into something much more muscular.
Yes, the spirit of rescue.
A spirit of rescue.
This is where the narrative arc really changes. The source argues that since the early 1900s, the world has repeatedly turned to the United States in moments of crisis. And when you look at the historical record, it's true. No other nation has conducted more large-scale rescue missions.
And we're talking military, economic, humanitarian, all of it.
All of it.
The list provided in the text is like a highlight reel of the 20th century, liberating Europe and Asia in World War II, defending South Korea, liberating Kuwait, stopping ethnic cleansing in the Balkans.
Let's just take one of those to really visualize what we're talking about. Think about the Berlin airlift again.
Okay, yeah, paint the picture for us.
So you have a massive city completely blockaded by the Soviets. Millions of people are going to starve. The logical military move might be to invade or just to give up.
Yeah.
Instead, the U.S. and its allies fly cargo planes over the city, landing every few minutes around the clock for months. They're dropping coal, flour, medicine, even candy for kids in tiny parachutes.
The famous candy bombers.
Right? That is the spirit of rescue in high definition. It's an immense logistical and financial burden undertaken just to save a population. And what's fascinating here is the psychological impact of that list over decades. It created a pattern.
The world began to expect it.
Exactly. The world began to expect the United States to lead, to help, and to rescue.
That's a huge shift in the relationship. It's one thing to decide to help because you want to. It's another thing entirely when everyone else is looking at you saying, well, are you going to fix this?
And whether it's fair or not, that expectation is now baked into the American identity. It's part of the global brand. But this brings us to the most critical tension in the source material. This is where the rubber meets the road and where things get complicated.
The awareness gap.
Yes, the awareness gap. This is the paradox at the heart of the modern American experience.
Okay, so let's break this down. On one side, let's call it side A. You have the global perspective we just talked about.
Right. Side A is the world's view. They see the United States as this global guardian or maybe the wealthy neighbor who has all the tools and the money to step in when a house catches fire. They see the power and the history of rescue, and they just assume the U.S. is always watching and ready.
But then you have side B, the domestic view. And I think this is where a lot of our listeners might be nodding their heads.
Side B is the reality for the average American citizen. Think about the voter in Ohio or Oregon or Arizona. They're focused on their jobs, rising inflation, their kids' tuition, the pothole at the end of their driveway.
Right.
That's the inward awareness dominating their day.
They don't wake up in the morning, pour a cup of coffee, and think, how shall I steward the global order today?
Not at all. And when they hear about the U.S. sending billions in aid or deploying troops to some region they can't find on a map, they don't always feel pride. Sometimes they feel exhaustion.
Of disconnect.
A total disconnect.
Now, the source is careful to say this isn't a character flaw, right? It's not that Americans are ignorant or selfish.
No, it's not ignorance. It's bandwidth. It's also just geography.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is a massive continent-spanning nation. You can drive for 3 days and never leave the country. It's naturally inward focused.
But here's why the source says this gap is dangerous.
Yes.
Because we're a republic.
Correct. In a republic, the citizens are ultimately the boss. They shape policy. If there's a massive gap between what the world expects the U.S. to do, side A, and what the voters understand their role to be, side B, you get friction.
You get a glitch in the operating system.
You get a disconnect where the government might be acting as a global rescuer, fulfilling that historical role. But the populace is asking, why are we doing this? Why does this even matter to me? If that gap gets too wide, the whole structure becomes unstable.
So what's the solution? Does the source offer a way to bridge this gap? Or are we just doomed to be misunderstood by the world and confused by our own foreign policy?
It argues for education, but specifically education that teaches global interdependence. The idea is to help citizens understand that they are simultaneously local residents and global citizens. It's about widening that aperture so that spirit of help we talked about earlier can mature into a more sophisticated understanding of global responsibility.
It's basically teaching people that the inward and outward awareness doesn't just apply to your neighbor down the street.
Right.
It applies to the ocean across the globe.
And this leads us to the final major concept in the deep dive, which I think is a really powerful image to wrap our heads around. The source proposes a new metaphor for this new era.
I loved this part. The source says that for centuries, nations lived as if each one were a separate house, just standing alone in a big open field.
Right. In that old model, you could lock your door, close your curtains, and whatever happened in the house a mile away, it didn't really affect you. If they had a flood, your house stayed dry.
But that is so not the world we live in anymore.
No. The new reality, according to the source, is that every house stands inside a city. Every nation lives inside a world.
That changes the dynamic completely. I mean, if your neighbor's apartment catches fire, you can't just ignore it because the smoke is coming into your living room.
Exactly.
If the street outside is crumbling, it affects your property value.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The United States is now both a home for its citizens and a neighbor in a very, very crowded global city. And the argument is that the spirit of the nation has to mature to reflect both of these roles simultaneously.
You can't just be the isolated house anymore.
No, that's isolationism, which is dangerous. But you also can't just be the town square where everyone dumps their problems.
You have to be both, which sounds difficult.
It's incredibly difficult. It's a balancing act that has never really been done before at this scale.
So if we look back at this operating system we've been uncovering, what do we have? We have a foundation of liberty that requires a balance of inward and outward awareness. We have a deep-seated spirit of help that grew from the frontier to global philanthropy. We have a history of rescue that created these massive global expectations. And now we have this challenge of the awareness gap, trying to reconcile our local lives with our global impact.
That is a very strong summary, and I think it's important to emphasize what the source says in its conclusion. This spirit of the United States, it isn't a myth. It's not a fairy tale where everything is perfect and Captain America saves the day without messing up his hair.
The text explicitly says it's a spirit that stumbles, rises, learns, and grows.
I appreciated that honesty. It admits that there have been failures. There have been times when the spirit of rescue was, misguided, or when the spirit of help was absent.
It carries both burden and possibility.
It's a heavy thing to carry. The source lists the components: liberty, help, generosity, rescue, responsibility, and calls it a living legacy. It's not a finished product sitting in a museum behind glass.
Right.
It's something that's being written right now by the people living it.
And by the people listening to this deep dive.
Yes, by you.
So here is where we want to leave you today. We've talked about the big picture nations, wars, global rescue missions, and it's easy to feel small next to all that. But the source ends with a challenge about a new balance. It says the spirit must be rooted in the home, but aware of the world.
Faithful to its ideals, responsive to its responsibilities.
So here is the provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If the United States, and by extension its citizens, has to be both a distinct home and a good neighbor in a global city, what does that look like for you personally?
That is the question. How do you practice that outward awareness in a way that is modern and relevant? How do you tend to your own house, your job, your family, your community, while recognizing that the house is sitting in the middle of a very busy, very connected city? It's not an easy balance, but according to our source, attempting that balance is exactly what the American spirit is all about.
It's the essential task of the modern citizen.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
It was a pleasure.
We'll catch you on the next one.